Hey everyone, welcome to another Scheldt week on this day in Canadian military history live stream. Excited to have Mike Bechthold on for the third time. Always great to have him on. Knows tons of stuff. Not much for me to say for introduction wise. A lot of you know who he is and what he's capable of and how he does amazing shows. So just a quick shout out to the sponsor of Scheldt Week. I'm very excited to have the first sponsor ever for OTD, which is great. So the Battlefield Tours has generously sponsored this week, help me out a little bit and get the word out in other ways. So all their links are down below, the link to their website. If you don't know Sam Cowan, you should. She's great and such an infectious personality, and she's so enthusiastic. It's great. So check out their website. They got a tour coming up in May 2023 related to the Netherlands, obviously connected to the Scheldt. So check out their website and see if that's something you might be interested in. So other than that, me and Mike will just get jumping in here and get started. So, hey, Mike, thanks for coming on again. It's always great to have you here.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. Really glad to be back. And hello to everybody out there in the virtual world. I can see a lot of familiar names in the chat, and it's great to have you all here to listen to me today. I would love to be able to comment in the chat box, but apparently the software doesn't let me do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure why.
Yeah, that's no fault of Brad's at all. But I can see all your comments, and please feel free to throw your questions in there, and I'll do what I can to answer you. But we're here to talk about air power in the Battle of the Scheldt, and they're two topics that are really important to me. Air power obviously doesn't get enough discussion in the general historical world, and the Battle of the Scheldt, well, that's kind of the Cinderella story of the Second World War. So we'll bring the two together and talk about it and see if we can shed some light on a really important topic that I think gives you a better idea of a whole bunch of things, a better idea of what air power is, what air power can do, what air power can offer to support of both the Navy and the Army. And I think the Battle of the Scheldt is, well, if you pressed me on it, I would probably say it's the most important campaign the Canadians fought in the Second World War. Certainly had the biggest impact in terms of contribution to overall victory. I know Juno Beach and the Battle of Normandy were important, and what the Canadians did there was impressive. The same with the Rhineland and Italy and everywhere else the Canadians were fighting. But the Scheldt was a different kind of battle. It was not an exclusively Canadian battle, but the Canadians were front and center in it. And it was a battle that really had much more far-reaching impacts in terms of opening up the port of Antwerp, allowing supplies to come in, and providing the logistical support that the Allied armies desperately needed to continue their war fighting at that point. So, yeah, so the Scheldt's an important thing. And when we talk about the Scheldt, and not enough people talk about the Scheldt, even fewer people talk about air power in the Scheldt. So that's what we're going to do today.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to jump in because you said that, right? Because I was talking about this last night on the AMA that I did. The Cinderella Army concept got brought up. It's funny to hear that, right? This is the Cinderella of the Cinderella story. It's like a nesting doll, lesser known of the lesser known. But that's one of the reasons why I wanted you to do this, because there's lots of questions, lots of misconceptions. You did the same with Normandy, so I'm excited to hear what you got for us and kind of can to peel some of that aside and set some of that aside and give us some insights.
Awesome. And I know for our audience today that I'm largely preaching to the converted. Everybody here is of a like mind. They've probably heard a lot of these ideas and viewpoints before, but it never hurts to get it out there. And maybe with it sitting on YouTube, we can find some more converts as people tune in to watch this in their hundreds, thousands, and ultimately millions. Right, Brad?
Well, let's hope so.
Awesome.
Let's start with the hundreds first, and then we'll see how that goes.
Perfect. All right, let me just swap my screens around a little bit. And okay, there we go. There, I think that changed on your screen. Is that right?
Yep. Good to go.
Okay, awesome. So here's what I want to talk about. Just a little bit of a direction we're going to go in today. We're going to talk about sort of the wider Scheldt battle, and I think I want to talk a lot about context, because context is important. I don't know, I know some of you follow me on Twitter. In the last couple of days, there's been a lot of talk about the bomber mafia and a certain Canadian journalist book that is maybe not worth the paper it's written on, but that's a discussion for another day. But I think if I had to point to one fault of that book, it's that it doesn't have any context. He tells a story, he pulls his ideas, he throws them out there, but without context, they're almost meaningless. And I think as historians, the most important thing we can do is to provide context, to provide an understanding of how what's happening fits into the bigger story, the wider fabric of what's going on, because ultimately that's why it is meaningful. That's how we can truly understand what's going on. So we're going to have a lot of context going on in our talk today. So we're going to talk about the escape of the German 15th Army across the Scheldt. We're going to talk about the role of Bomber Command in sinking the island of Walcheren. We're going to then sort of get down into the weeds, and we're going to talk about close air support, tactical aviation, and the role of 2nd Tactical Air Force, specifically 84 Group primarily, in Operation Switchback and Operation Infatuate. That's the capture of the Breskens Pocket and the capture of the Beveland Isthmus. And then we'll sort of have some concluding thoughts to wrap things up.
Sounds good. People are, let's say, responding to the Bomber Mafia comments.
Yeah, I see
like
Colin
here.
saying absolutely talking, and absolutely, it's a terrible book. I've just finished writing what I thought was going to be a short review that is now sitting at 2,000 words, and it's probably going to be another 500 before I'm done. That is just absolutely slaughtering the book because it's just wrong and imprecise and lacking context in so many different ways that I couldn't do it in the sort of 750 to 1,000 words that was first asked for.
And Alex has summed it up exactly how I think about this.
yeah. But anyway, I could go on about this for quite a long time and be quite sidetracked talking about Woody's rabbit holes, but we'll try to stay out of those right now. So air power was important. John Terrain called it the decisive factor in the Normandy campaign. And well, again, that's a story for another day. I don't agree with that. I think air power, tactical air power especially, was just one tool in the toolbox for the Allies and how they won in Normandy. That it was like a symphony. You needed all of the woodwinds and the horns and the drums and all that to come together to create a beautiful sound. And air power was just one of those things. It didn't it didn't stand out as something that, if without air power we wouldn't have won. Would have been more difficult, it would have been more costly, it would have lasted longer, but I think you still would have won. So I don't think you can say it's decisive, and that kind of goes for the entire war in general. This is an interpretation that I've talked about in the past, Hollywood's interpretation. And I think that scene, the sort of the penultimate scene in Saving Private Ryan, where the group is in the town. They're just about to get overrun by the Germans. The Tiger tank is crossing the bridge, and all of a sudden in swoops the cavalry, the two P-51 Mustangs that come in, see the problem, drop their bombs with pinpoint accuracy, and save the day. And I think Hollywood's interpretation is often the way a lot of us look at air power, as a way to sort of save the day, to sweep in, to be precise, to get the job done. And really, that's not the case. That's not how it worked at all. If we were going to have a longer discussion of tactical air power, we could talk about how imprecise fighter bombers were, how hard it was for them to find their targets, let alone hit them. So when you see that in Hollywood, that's really not the reality. And I think we'll see that in our discussion of air power in the Scheldt. So again, with this context phase, we have to understand how we got there. So the Battle of Normandy is wrapping up at the end of August. It looks like the Germans are running. They've broken. There's not going to be a serious stand on the Seine River. They're flying back to Belgium. It looks like maybe the war might be won by Christmas. There's a lot of euphoria. There's a lot of expectation in the Allied armies that maybe we've won this and there's not going to be any hard fighting. But as the Allies push north, slowly but surely, the Germans get their act together. They start to dig in. They start not to run. They start to fight back. And before too long, it's clear that there is going to be a fight. It's not the end of the war. The Germans just needed time and space to recover. And of course they did. One thing that did happen during this period, though, was that the port of Antwerp was captured on the 4th of September by, I believe it was 11th British Armored Division. And this is an absolutely enormous coup for the Allies. Antwerp is one of, if not the biggest port in Europe, an absolutely crucial asset to have in terms of supplying your armies. And not only was the port captured without a fight, it was captured intact. It was captured so quickly with the help of the Belgian White Brigade that the Germans didn't have time to wreck the port, to blow up the docks, to wreck the cranes, to sink block ships into the channels and prevent the Allies from using it in any kind of efficient fashion. Just an absolutely enormous coup. But there's one problem, and that's the fact that Antwerp lies at the end of a 50-mile long estuary. So here's another slide showing the Allied advance on a broad front, all the way up to Antwerp at the top of the map. But as you can see, and I think I can get a pointer going, right here is Antwerp, and you can see the North Sea here. But to get to Antwerp from the North Sea, you have to go down this 50-mile long, 75-kilometer Scheldt estuary. And the Germans hold both banks of it, an area they call Fortress South Scheldt and Fortress North Scheldt. And that's going to be the focus of what we're talking about. Also going on at this period are the capture of the Channel ports, and that's what the Canadians have been tasked to do, 1st Canadian Army. Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk, and eventually Ostend are all given to the Canadians to capture. And they're an important fit in this story of logistically supplying the Allied armies, because these are all ports. Now, they're small ports. They don't have a high capacity, but you put them all together and hopefully you'll be able to get enough ammunition, fuel, food, and other goods in just to keep the armies fighting. Operation Well Hit was the first operation, and what's important here are the dates: 17 to 22 September. Undergo the capture of Calais is next, right afterwards, and then ultimately the piece de résistance, the capture of the giant gun batteries at Cap Gris-Nez on the 29th of September. So while this is going on, we can go back to that previous map. You can see that the Allies have installed themselves at Antwerp, and the German army is sort of trapped in this big pocket. Boulogne falls, Calais falls, Cap Gris-Nez falls, and the Germans are being pressed in this direction. They can't go across here because the Allies control all that. So that leaves them only one place to go, except it's a dead end. It's a water barrier right there. So what is going to happen? And again, the contextual piece here is that Operation Market Garden is also taking place at this point. Launched on the 17th of September, was Montgomery's grand plan to bounce the Rhine, to capture the major bridges over the Rhine River and its estuaries, force a way into Germany, and hopefully cause that end of the war to happen by Christmas 1944. Again, we don't need to get into the details of it. Ultimately, Market Garden was a case of good idea gone wrong. Didn't work out. All the bridges were captured except for the one at Arnhem, and there was a lot of fighting there. But the problem is, once Market Garden's been launched, you can't just pull out. You can't just abandon what you've done. You have to hold on to it, and the Allies are holding it, but the Germans are trying to win it back. And this is what the front line looked like on the 1st of October, 1944. I see in the chat there's a comment about the supply lines, and that's important to remember. As this is all going on, Antwerp hasn't been opened up as a usable port. The Channel ports aren't usable. So all the Allied supplies are coming in over the original D-Day beaches and being trucked all the way up to the fighting front, 200-300 miles. And the fact that the Allies were able to do that, it's absolutely impressive that they had the organization, the trucks, the freedom. They didn't have to worry about Luftwaffe attacks on their lines of communications. But it was costly, it was time consuming, and it wasn't efficient. And they were getting to the point where they couldn't go much farther without having ports that were closer to where they wanted to be. I need to apologize for this slide. I know the image of the front line is maybe not family friendly on this, but it gives you an idea of where the Allies were and what they were trying to do. So we've got the Germans in the Breskens pocket trying to escape across the Scheldt estuary and then flee down the Beveland Isthmus and out into freedom. As all this is going on in the second half of September and into October, the Germans are trying to nip off the salient that was created by Operation Market Garden. So there's a lot of attacks that are coming west to east and east to west at the base and all along the sides of that salient. And a lot of the troops that are being thrown into that fight are coming right off the Beveland Isthmus and being thrown right into that. So that's the stakes we're dealing with at this point in the war. So the German 15th Army was somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 to 150,000 men, fully supplied with tanks and artillery and everything that a modern fighting army needs to have. And the only way they could survive to fight another day was to escape across the Scheldt estuary. And for the most part, they were able to do that without any interference from the Allies, either Allied naval forces or Allied air forces. And we've got lots of aerial photographs that show this. This is clearly a shot taken on the 11th of September. This is the port of Breskens. And here we have a large ferry and a few smaller ships that are carrying troops of German 15th Army across from Breskens to Vlissingen or Breskens as the British, or sorry, not Breskens, Flushing as the British called it. And they're doing it without too much trouble. They have three routes they're using. The Breskens Flushing route is about 5 kilometers. They have another one further to the south that's Terneuzen into Hansweert, which is on the Beveland Isthmus, and it's about 18 kilometers. And then there's another shorter one that crosses, and I'm not even going to try to say the name of that. Elswoersdijk, perhaps. Dutch is not an easy language for me. Is about 5 kilometers. And again, they weren't trying to sneak across. They weren't moving at night. They weren't waiting for bad weather. They were just moving their ships across with very little interference. And they could do that because they had substantial anti-aircraft defenses along the shores that covered the entire gap. The Allies tried some attacks and found that the anti-aircraft fire was too intense, so they couldn't interdict the ships that were crossing, even if they could find them. Another shot from the 11th of September. They're clearly there. They're easy to find, but they were difficult to attack. Here's a photograph of the port of Terneuzen. It was taken on the 13th of September. You can see it's a small port. There's not a lot of sort of port facilities to facilitate it, but they managed to bring in the small ships and load them up with men and trucks and horses and everything else that a fighting army would have. Here is part of the port at Flushing, Vlissingen, and you can see a couple of the escaping ships getting in there and lots of others that are moored up along the harbor side. Now, the Allies were attacking these ports. Primarily, it was the medium bombers of 2nd Tactical Air Force. This wasn't considered an important enough target to take away the heavy bombers of Bomber Command, let alone the B-17s and B-24s of 8th Army, 8th U.S. Air Force. But you can see that the attacks were having an effect. If you zoom in, you can see lots of bomb holes on the port area.
Yeah, I can't do that anymore. It doesn't let me.
Sorry?
I can't zoom in, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. If you can just sort of lean into the screen.
Yeah, you gotta get in real close.
Lots of.
I used to be able to do that with this software, but it doesn't let me do it.
Oh, okay. I don't know if I can do that. Just a second.
You might be able to with yours, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I can.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, there. So, yeah, you can see there's lots of bomb hits doing that. And they had impacts, but not anything that really stopped or even slowed down. You can see most of the main town of Breskens has been bombed into shells of the houses. But there's still ships in the harbor. They're still loading up. If I had other photos, I could show you that there's lines of vehicles and other traffic that are on the roads leading up to the port, and It's all right there for the seeing, but the Allies weren't able to interdict that, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why and what it meant. So you can see on this slide, I give some of the details of the air raids. They were relatively small in scale. Probably the most significant one took place on the 11th of September, where about 120 Germans were killed. And it did destroy some material, and it closed the port for about 10 hours. But that's not really anything that could stop the escape of 15th Army. Same on the 12th of September when Terneuzen was bombed. It closed the port for 24 hours, but soon after that, it was back open again. And the various heavy attacks on Vlissingen, including the one on the 15th of September, again caused damage. The loading and unloading would stop for the duration of the raid, but it was back in order very soon thereafter. We can easily tally up what this meant for the German army. Before the 7th of September, before the escape really geared up, we estimate that about 25,000 troops got out. But then over the 11 days from the 9th to the 24th of September, when they were using those three routes, they had well over 100,000 troops, parts of 9 divisions, were able to escape. 7,000 vehicles, 6,000 horse wagons, 750 guns. I mean, this is an enormous amount of men and material and guns. And it wasn't just the small stuff that was escaping. They were taking the biggest, heaviest guns with them as well, with very little difficulty. So it's a really impressive escape by the German 15th Army. And it leads to questions about why weren't the Allies able to stop them? Why couldn't they stop them? And I think it's James Holland makes the comment that really anytime an army set its mind to escaping across the sea, nobody was really able to do it. And he gives the example of Dunkirk and Sicily. I have the comparative numbers here, that when the army wanted to escape, it was pretty much able to do that, and enemy air forces weren't able to interdict or stop that from happening in any significant way. And you can see the Messina to Calabria numbers were similar. It was not as long a route. Most of the routes were sort of under 4 kilometers. There was 2 longer ones they used. The numbers weren't as high: 40,000 fit troops, as many as 18,000 wounded troops, and a smaller number of vehicles, tanks, and assault guns. So we hear a lot about the escape from Sicily and how the Allies failed and all that, but we don't hear quite as much about the escape of German 15th Army. And it's an interesting question because you have to, I think it's Terry Kopp poses the question, well, what if you did stop them? What's going to happen? So you've got 100,000, maybe not quite 100,000 that are left in the Breskins pocket. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear the dogs barking. My kids getting home from school and setting off the canine alarm system. If 15th Army had been trapped, what's going to happen with those 100,000 troops?
Yeah.
You're certainly not capturing the Breskins pocket. If you're not capturing the Breskins pocket, you're not opening the port of Antwerp. So maybe it was a good thing in the grander scheme of things that 15th Army escaped. Sure, you had to fight them later. Sure, you had to deal with them at a later point in the campaign. But maybe you were able to do that better because you had the ability to logistically supply your troops through Antwerp. So it's a one of those what if questions that we can never answer, but is worthwhile looking at for what it tells us about what did happen. Just there were other opportunities to interdict the movement. The one I've never seen anybody talk about is why did the Allied Air Forces not lay mines in that channel? The RAF was committed to mine laying in German ports and other places along the North Sea to interdict German coastal convoys and German naval traffic in and out of their ports. But they had devoted 100 sorties to dropping aerial mines in that passage. What would have happened then? might have been effective, but I'm not sure that it was ever an option that was on the table. But again, that leads us to that question. Well, okay, what if they were successful? What do we do with 15th Army?
Yep.
They could interdict at the Walcheren Causeway, and I've got some photos to show that. That's one of the choke points. There were other choke points at Goes and across the Beveland Canal, and then of course at Vonstruct, where the Black Watch had such a terrible time on the 13th of October trying to close that position against fierce German defenses and counterattacks. So here's a photo of the Walcheren Causeway. This was taken in April 44, and it shows a largely undamaged causeway. Again, I can zoom in and show you. This is a narrow road and railway that crosses a, Walcheren used to be an island, and this is the road and rail link to the mainland. If you go there today, it's a very difficult place to find because this... I'm not sure even how to get back there. This whole area has been filled in by the Dutch. They're incredibly like busy beavers with reclaiming land from the sea, and Walcheren is really not an island in any way, shape, or form now because all this has been filled in and made into usable land. So the Walcheren Causeway is no more. There's still a highway that goes through there, but it's no longer that kind of exposed salient that it was in 1944. The causeway was attacked repeatedly by the RAF. I love this photo. It's a photo taken by a raid during 320 Squadron, a Dutch medium bomber squadron. I think they flew B-25s on the 11th, 12th, and 13th of September. You can see the smoke from the attacks, the bombs bursting below. And then here we have a photo that was taken near the end of October that shows the impacts of all those various attacks. Bomb craters along the entire length of the causeway, severing the rail line, but really didn't interdict German traffic along that avenue. Trains could no longer cross it, so German trains would do a shuttle service. They would go to the western end, drop off troops, vehicles, whatever. They would walk across the causeway and then board train cars again on the other side to continue their escape. So yes, it slowed things down, but it never did stop them. So that's kind of all I want to say about that. Brad, do you want to take questions on each section of these, or do you want me to push ahead and we'll save all the questions?
Let me see if there's anything we can talk about. There's a question about bypassing, particularly the Breskins pocket, but I think others in the chat have handled that quite well about the whole concept of what we're talking about is keeping the Scheldt shipping lane open. If you have troops on that shore, you can't. So I think we're good for now if you want to keep going.
Okay, sure. And I'm using a very anglicized pronunciation of Scheldt. The first time I heard somebody in Dutch say the word, I didn't even know what they were talking about.
Yeah.
Comes across something as Schelde or
it's very different.
like that. Again, I apologize for my Dutch pronunciations, but yeah, that's my excuse or my explanation. So the next thing I want to talk about is the sinking of Walcheren, and we'll talk about Norma's favorite general for a little bit. Maybe not favorite, second favorite, General Simmons.
Number one all the time.
Yeah, Simmons is a really interesting character. He's not going to be anybody's best friend. He's not going to win any personality awards. But I do think that he was one of the most innovative and adaptive generals in the Second World War, that he was always trying to find new ways to make things work. Sometimes it was successful, sometimes it wasn't. But I mean, in Normandy, he was trying to do Simmons. In Normandy, he was trying night attacks. He was innovating armored personnel carriers. Yep. And in the Scheldt, he was the one that came up with the idea of sinking Walcheren Island. And you have to understand that Walcheren is one of the most heavily defended positions on the coast of occupied Europe. It was a veritable strong point that the Germans had turned into a position that was key in their defense of the Reich. From the strategic bombing offensive, they had a lot of anti-aircraft guns and anti-aircraft gun positions on the island, but it was also heavily fortified against an amphibious assault with dozens of concrete bunkers, heavy guns, machine guns, minefields, beach defenses to prevent an amphibious operation. So before anything could go with opening the Scheldt estuary, Walcheren had to be captured and neutralized. And it was Simmons that came up with the idea of sinking the island. And again, this is one of these areas that had been reclaimed by the Dutch over the years, that it was a largely an area that was below sea level, and they built up these high dikes all around the perimeter of the island. And his idea was that if we could take our bombers and breach the dikes in 2 or 3 or 4 locations, allow the sea to flood in and reclaim the island, it would neutralize those German defenses. And of course, that's a great idea in an abstract way, but then you got to think about the Dutch and the people that live there, who are friendly, who are our allies, who were trying to rescue and liberate. And here you want to destroy their homes, destroy their farms. There was a great fear that with the seawater flowing over those fertile fields, it could destroy them for years, decades, even, from the salt encroaching on them. But and I'm not clear on the story of where the approval came from. I think it came from Eisenhower. Some folks say that the Dutch government in exile was consulted. Others say it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it was. But Simmons received approval and support from Bomber Command in its attempt. And they went forward and sank the island. And it was successful. It achieved most of what they'd hoped to do. And but you can see that the impact on the Dutch, the water came with a speed and force that they had not believed possible. After all, the dikes had been around the island, no one could ever imagine them giving way. And it was a few hundred bombers that was able to do that. This is an air photo that was taken that shows that breach and in the dike at Walcheren. This is the of West Capelle.
Yes.
So this is the town of West Capelle. You can see the lighthouse here. The lighthouse is there, and the shadow of it beside it. And remember that, because we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But the bombers came in, breached the dike, and it allowed the sea to flood the island. This image is a composite air photo that was taken up to the 21st of October, and it shows the area that was covered. So this is the island. The Walcheren Causeway was here. West Capelle's here. Flushing, Vlissingen is down here, and all this area in here with the wavy lines, it's about 90% of the island, was flooded. So the attacks were made at West Capelle on the 3rd of October, at Vlissingen on either side of Vlissingen on the 7th of October, and then one final attack at Veer on the northeast corner of the island on the 11th of October. And the effect was to allow the sea to come in and flood the majority of the island. So, like I said, we have to remember the civilian impact in this, because I think too often military historians talk about the armies and the air forces and the navies, and don't talk enough about the impact of the war on the lands they're fighting. So Kirk Goodlett, who did his PhD at Laurier, wrote a dissertation on the destruction and subsequent recovery of Zeeland, which is this portion of Walcheren Island. But this picture you can see was taken after the war, and it's at ground level in West Capelle. You can see the water still there. You can see the result of all the flooding. The dike has been breached and the area has been dried, but it's still a waste. And here at the top, you can see that lighthouse that looms over the village. These are just a few pictures of West Capelle during the war. These are, on the top left and right, are images that show the extent of the flooding, the flooded roads, the flooded fields, and the impact it had. The bottom left corner is West Capelle before the war, so you can see the dike going around here. This is the village. again, the lighthouse is back here. And then this is looking at it from the other direction. So it's been rotated 180 degrees. You can see the breach in the dike and the seawater that is flowing in. The lighthouse would be down here, just off our photograph. And the reason I keep showing you that lighthouse, there's a picture that I took in, I guess it was 2019, was the last time I was there, looking down that main street at the lighthouse. And I didn't actually know this was there. I was lucky enough to stay there for one evening when I was over there for a conference, and I just went exploring on my own. And I stayed in West Capel, and after dinner, I went out for a walk, and I walked down to the lighthouse and was wandering around. There's a big cemetery that surrounds that lighthouse, but in behind there's a cross, and behind the cross is an enormous field of I don't think they're gravestones, they're markers that are naming all of the local villagers that were killed during the war. And the vast majority of them, over 200, were killed in the Allied bombings of West Capel. And that just, it floored me. Like, it absolutely floored me that the war, that the Allies, that the ones coming to save and rescue and liberate were the ones that had killed such a large percentage of the local villagers that died during the war. And you wander through the field. This is a couple of images that I took. There you've got a 31-year-old, I don't know, father, mother, and a 4-year-old child. The right beside that, you've got two children, Van Peen, brother, sister, I don't know, 10 years old and 1 year old. Like, it's just absolutely sobering to see that field with all those markers and think that's the toll of the war. That is a cost that the Dutch bore for the war. They weren't happy about it, but I don't think they're angry about it. I think they accept it as the cost of liberation, and it's terrible and it's unthinkable. But it was a cross they had to bear on that road to being liberated. So I think it's essential that as we look at this, we don't forget that we don't concentrate on the battles of the Canadians opening Antwerp and the Germans defending it and everything like that, without remembering that there were other people involved in this. So I think it's absolutely essential. I see Stephen's asking, were the civilians warned? Absolutely, they were. The Allied bombers went in ahead of time and dropped pamphlets saying that the dikes were going to be bombed and you should get yourselves out of there. But I don't know how effective that was. I don't know how many received the message. I don't know how many who received the message believed the message, or if they believed it had the ability or capacity to leave, escape, whether the Germans would allow it, whether they had anywhere else to go, etc. So.
Sorry, just jump in there real quick, Mike, because this is something I've looked at, and it's all come back to me from doing this quite a while ago. But going back to the idea of you talking about the attitudes of those who live there, I saw a lot of parallels with the bombing of Caen, right? It's not anger. It's not, they're not happy about it, but it's not anger, right? They see it as a not necessarily something that's necessary, because it's not to them, right, to have family members killed, but it's a complicated one, and it's talked about quite a bit in some of the digging I was able to do about this, and also with the warning order. A lot of them talked about how they couldn't get away. They were too old. They had family members that were either too young or too old, and I think it's reflected in the cemetery you were just showing there. Those years, I saw a lot of older people and younger people. It's too hard, and there was nowhere to go anyway. They said on the island, once the flooding started, they said there would be nowhere to go. So they were just kind of stuck. So and some of them just didn't believe it. Some thought it was fake, from what I remember. So it's a really interesting part of this.
Yeah, and I mean, when we talk about sinking the island, we're not talking about the water coming in and sort of making homes disappearing. For the most part, the water was relatively shallow, like a foot deep, 2 feet deep, 3 feet deep. So you could cross it, you could walk through it. It covered roads, but if you knew where the roads were, you could stick on it. So it didn't really stop the Germans from doing anything. It flooded very few of the bunkers, but it made it more difficult to get around. It made it more difficult for communications and things like that. So was it successful? Yes. Did it impact the ability of the Germans to defend the island? Absolutely. Could they have done it without flooding the island? Again, that's one of those what ifs that
Yeah.
I'm not prepared to answer. Maybe, probably. Would it have been more costly? Yes. Would it have taken longer? Probably. But again, I'm not really sure there's a good answer to that.
Yeah, is it okay if we take some questions here and kind
Yeah,
of a
of course.
discussion? I know you mentioned this briefly, but I do want to just kind of get it again. Is the concept of, you mentioned Simmons' idea to break the dikes, but also who gave support and whether or not the Dutch government in exile was consulted. As far as I know, they were not. I was not able to find anything in confirmation that they were, and the final decision didn't go all the way up to Ike. So is that kind of what you have found as well?
Yeah, and that, I think that's what I said before, that some sources say they were consulted, some sources say they weren't, but I've never been able to prove or find a source, like Dudley says, that confirms that the Dutch government was consulted. I think I think that the dissertation I quoted earlier goes into that issue, and
Okay.
I believe that he says that they weren't consulted. But again, I haven't looked at that recently. But yeah, my memory of that is that they weren't consulted ultimately, and that the decision came from, I believe it was Eisenhower, was the final decision maker on that.
Yeah, as far as I know. And then just an actual question about the attacks itself. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, tall boys used to breach the dikes, particularly in 7th and 11th. I'm not entirely sure.
I don't think they were. I think it was just
no.
high explosive bombs.
Okay.
Again, I'd have to go back and check that, but I don't think it was 617 Squadron. I think it was just regular squadrons of Bomber Command that were doing it with high explosives, and probably sort of 1,000 and 2,000 pound bombs, maybe even 4,000 pound bombs. But I don't think it was any of the special tall boys or Grand Slams that were used here.
Yeah, maybe I was mixing it up with some of the raids on the V weapons facilities.
Yeah,
in my head.
Yeah, and in fact, let me just go back. Like, if you look at this image, like, those are just small bomb holes.
Yeah, you're right.
They're 500, 1,000, maybe 2,000 pound bombs. And if you drop enough of them, they're going to get the job done. And once, you know how water works. Once you get a crack in it,
that's all you need.
Erosion is going to come in and help you finish the job. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Yeah.
All right.
Sorry, just going here. Mark Loop says 9th Squadron attacked. They had tall boys then. Just finished digitizing their records. We'll check. Cool.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Mark Loop, if you find out later, just leave a comment down below afterwards. That'd be great.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know. And just a little trivia fact, because I love little trivia facts. The Allies helped to rebuild the dikes at the end of the war.
Yep.
And one of the big things they used to make that happen were pieces of the Mulberry harbors.
Yep.
So they refloated pieces from the Mulberry harbor, sailed them down the coast, and placed the big concrete caissons in position in the breaches, and use that as sort of the core of closing off the breaches and filling them in. So. Yep.
Yeah, that was discussed earlier in the comments. So it's, again, so interesting in how these things come together.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, let's switch gears now and go to the story of close air support. That's a photo I love of the Highland Light Infantry. It's my local regiment from Waterloo County, Ontario, in I believe it's the area of Breskens, towards the end of the fighting in Operation Switchback. But for Antwerp to be open, there were two battles three, I guess, that the Canadians had to fight. One was opening the Breskens Pocket, and that's this area here in this map. The other was capturing Walcheren, and then also opening the Beveland Isthmus, and we'll get to those in a little bit. But Operation Switchback is the one that I've looked at in some detail, and it's a really interesting case study. The fighting here is I don't want to say definitively that it was unlike anything anywhere else in the war, but
Mm.
it had its own nature. It was against a deeply entrenched enemy. It was across an unforgiving battlefield. The Breskins Pocket was essentially an island. It was bordered on all four sides by water: the North Sea, the Scheldt estuary, the Brackman Inlet. The Leopold Canal is a single line along the south, and it is a double line to the west. And there's really only one small little pocket in the southwest, or sorry, southeast corner, where there was a land bridge, but it was soggy and well defended and not really useful. So anyway, the Canadians were going to get there was going to be across a water barrier of some kind. It was also polder country, so that area that the Dutch had reclaimed from the sea. So most of the fields were flat below sea, but bounded by dikes, which raised up anywhere from 2, 3, 4 meters above, sometimes higher. And it was just an absolute terrible battlefield to fight across. The fields were mostly too muddy to cross. The infantry could, but any kind of vehicle couldn't. So really the fight was about controlling the roads, the dikes, and the Germans had everything they needed to defend the area. It was controlled by the German 64th Infantry Division that was above strength at this point. They had the advantage of having a full complement of men, plus all the heavy weapons and more that they could ever want, because a lot of the units that were evacuating, because of course many of them were going from here at Breskins across to Flushing, they would abandon their heavy weapons, their stocks of ammunition. So 64th Division had no shortage of machine guns, 20 millimeter cannons, all the ammunition they could possibly use. So they had a lot of advantages. So again, here we come to Simmons, and I'll say his brilliant plan to capture the pocket, because straight in attack is going to be difficult. It's going to be costly. So he had to come up with some kind of a way to find an advantage for the Canadians, because of course the Canadians don't have a material advantage in terms of numbers for this battle. It's really just one Canadian infantry division that is making the attack against a German overstrength division.
Yeah.
So it might even be a case that the Canadians were outnumbered, not even possessing the sort of 3-to-1 ratio that attacking forces usually expect to have to be successful. So Simmons had to come up with a clever plan, and his idea was to launch a distracting attack, a diverting attack here in the south on the 6th of October, and then the next day to launch an amphibious assault using Buffaloes, which was a tracked amphibious vehicle that was largely used by the Americans in the Pacific, to sail along the Scheldt estuary and land at a couple of beaches and attack the Germans from the rear of their position. And unfortunately, there were some problems with it. The Buffaloes had trouble getting into position in time. So when 7th Brigade attacked across the Leopold Canal, instead of having 24 hours on their own, they had about 72 hours before they could get sort of the pressure relaxed by 9th Brigade and their amphibious landing. And I won't talk about that anymore, because I know Dave Patterson's going to be talking about the RMRs, the Royal Montreal Regiment, and their role in their one battle in the war, crossing the Leopold Canal. So he can tell you all the details of that. But it was nasty fighting. And the Canadians needed force multipliers. And one of the biggest aces they had up their sleeve during this battle was air power. So their close support was being provided by 84 Group, Royal Air Force. Again, sort of the trivia side of things, 83 Group was the other group in 2nd Tactical Air Force. Majority of those squadrons were Canadian. You would think that the Canadian RCAF squadrons would be supporting the Canadians, but that wasn't the case. 83 Group supported 2nd British Army, and the British 84 Group was supporting the Canadians. That had to do with planning for Overlord and how that all worked out. But regardless, Leslie Brown, who was the commander of 84 Group, worked really well with the Canadians. He was completely committed to the role of close air support. And in fact, he was ultimately replaced in November for working too closely with the Canadians, which just seems absolutely bizarre. But it goes into RAF politics and RAF higher command and what they think the role of the Air Force is, that it should be an independent service, that it should be fighting a campaign to win the war on its own, and that support of the Army was maybe not the best thing to be doing. And Brown got along really well with his counterparts in 1st Canadian Army, provided them as much support as he possibly could, but his commanders thought maybe that wasn't the absolute best thing, and he ended up getting relieved because of that. So there's when we talk about air-ground cooperation, we can talk about the direct effects of what the aircraft were doing in attacking, and they were flying fighter sweeps. Some of them were pre-arranged missions where there would be a meeting the night before. The Army would say, here's our objectives, here's what we want to do, here's where we know the Germans are, can you hit it? The RAF would look at it, they'd say, yes, we can hit it, and they would schedule a mission for the next day and go in and do it. They were also using new tactics like winkles, and a winkle is an idea that the Canadians would designate a box where everything in the box was meant to be attacked. So the artillery would fire smoke shells at the 4 corners of that box, define the area where it was a weapons free for the RAF, and then the RAF would go in, and anything that moved, anything that looked like a potential target, they could go in and hit without fear of a friendly fire, blue on blue kind of incident. And those worked very well. There was also a lot of indirect effects that the Air Force could have as well. Artillery is an interesting one because the Germans, and I think all Army troops have the feeling that if the Air Force is above us, if we can see them, they can see us. And if we do anything to expose our positions, we will risk getting hit and knocked out or killed or whatever. So the Canadian Army noticed very clearly that when the RAF was flying over the battlefield, German artillery shut up. It stopped firing. So, of course, having an artillery gun just stop firing because the RAF is in the area isn't the best solution, but it's pretty damn good that the ultimate goal is to make that gun not interfere with your own forces. So if the RAF could come in, and even if they couldn't blow up that artillery tube, they could make it stop firing. Well, even if it's a sort of transitional effect, it still has a big impact, and you could have an assurance that aircraft would be in the area when you're doing certain tasks to limit the amount of artillery fire, even if you couldn't find and destroy those guns. The Germans just needed to know that the RAF had a really hard time of finding those targets and knocking them out. There were some operational research studies that were done before the campaign in Northwest Europe kicked out, where they did some tests, and they would put a mock artillery battery in the field, camouflage it the way it would normally be done, and send the Air Force to go hit it, and they wouldn't find it. They could even be given a 6-digit map reference saying, here's where that target is, go knock it out, and they couldn't find it. And even if they could find it, their chances of actually hitting it were pretty slim, because the weapons they dropped, the rocket projectiles and the airdrop bombs, were not terribly effective. Machine guns were very active, but again, accurate. But again, the machine guns and cannons wouldn't necessarily knock out an artillery piece or get the men if they're in their trenches or behind a tree or something like that. So the artillery was very difficult to knock out, and not a target that the Air Force liked going at. Morale is a big deal. Again, the Germans had a feeling that the aircraft see them individually and get them. So when you've got air power over the battlefield, it is going to slow down and distract the enemy in doing whatever they are doing. There's a great quotation from the Can Scott's War Diary that says if a gun position gives us trouble after the artillery, he's attacked by typhoon. That way, it makes the gunners wish they had no more furor. I'm not sure that's exactly true, but that's the view the Canadian soldiers had. So they're getting a positive morale boost from tactical air support, and the German soldiers have that exact opposite view and getting a sort of a drowning of their morale from air power. Dan Spry was the commander of 3rd Division during this battle, and he wrote a really useful and interesting report about air support in Operation Switchback. And it's worth quoting at it. I'm sorry for all the words. I hate using a lot of words on my slides, but I think it's important to include the exact language that Spry used, because it really conveys the view of the Army, how they looked at air power and what it meant to them. So you can see him saying that success was due in no small measure to the effect of air support. Those are really important words coming from the Army. It caused a breakdown in communications and morale. On the opposite side of the things, the 3rd Canadian Division only were subjected to 2 enemy air attacks during the entire month of October. So essentially it was not there compared to the RAF being there. I can't say every day. I don't know if I have the stats up, but I think it was 16 of 32 days that the RAF was able to fly air support because of the poor weather. The other days, the weather was outside of safe conditions for the Air Force. It was too windy, too foggy, too rainy, that they couldn't do anything. So again, the morale of our own support was important. Oh yeah, okay. Here I've got the exact.
Here we go. Yeah.
653 sorties, and a sortie is one flight by one aircraft. So that's 653 individual aircraft missions over 16 days. Another 508 medium and heavy bombers contributed. But again, we're looking at total 84 group effort during this period. And you can see they're flying 87, almost 8,800 sorties during this period. And it's about a quarter of their missions are being devoted to air support. So some of those missions are being directed at supporting Second British Army in the Market Garden salient and helping them there. Some of them are going on the various tasks that the Air Force is asked to do, reconnaissance missions. Some armed reconnaissance are just kind of a free-for-all, go to these map coordinates, see what you can find, hit something if you see it. But it gives you an idea that the Air Force is really busy during this period, but they're not devoting even half of their combat power to supporting the Canadians. So the Canadians are getting help, but they're not getting anywhere near the amount of help that they could be getting if the powers that be decided that. And it's interesting that Air Vice Marshal Brown is criticized for overly supporting the Canadians, but even still, what's considered overly supporting is only a fraction of the combat strength that he's
right. Okay, just before we, sorry, excuse me, before we continue on, a question from the Great Dominion about forward air observers and cab rank for these.
Yeah, that's a good question, because we don't have really good understandings of how air support worked in 1st Canadian Army. There's a really useful document that you can find online. It's either a CMH, no, it's a AFQ report on air support for 1st Canadian Army, and it gives a lot of details on how it worked. But one of the books that I have in my back pocket that one day when I win the lottery and I'm independently wealthy and can just sit home and write books all day, I want to write a book on, and I would call it Air Support for 1st Canadian Army, because I think it would be a really interesting story to look at how the Army was supported during the war in detail, how it worked, how did the Army and the Air Force get along, what structures did they have in place, and how did they change over time? Because the way air support worked on D-Day was very different from how it worked at Area Air Ridge, which was again completely different in how it evolved by the time of Operation Switchback, and then it had changed again by the time of the Rhineland operation.
Right.
And
Yeah. Sorry, just jump in there. It's something that I've kind of stumbled on recently, just when depending on what I'm looking at, depending on who's looking at what unit. It's just it comes up in time and time again. I keep seeing it about the file, and I get excited, as I'm sure lots of other historians have had this experience. You think it's going to be awesome, and then you open it, and it's kind of a letdown. That's happened to me with a couple of air support files lately because I've been trying to just kind of collect them as I go, and it's never quite what I want it to be, which is
yeah, because and it's interesting because the Army doesn't usually tell the air story, and the air certainly doesn't tell the Army story.
right.
And you can extrapolate that to Army historians generally aren't interested in the Air Force, and
Yeah,
Air Force historians aren't interested in telling the Army story. So you get this weird no man's land where
yeah,
you've got Air Force historians that are trying to talk about close air support without knowing about how the Army works. Army historians that are trying to tell the air side of things without really understanding how the Air Force works, and it all becomes kind of like kissing your sister. It's not very satisfying. It's not what you need. It's not really telling the full story. And I think what's really needed is somebody to come in that understands the Army and understands the Air Force and can understand those issues in a level of detail that for the most part is not available out there.
yeah. I was going to call out Alex, but he's got enough going on with a new baby at home. But he's one that comes to mind. Not to put any pressure on him, but get on that. Another quick question here. I think we already know the answer, but it's good to reiterate it. Is there's no written procedures?
Yeah, so there were written procedures, and they evolved as the campaign went on. The Allies had, I guess it's worth. We can start with what the Americans were doing because the Americans came up with a system called armored column cover, which is they developed a system where they had a tank with a VHF radio that had a experienced combat pilot in the turret on that radio. And as the American armored column advanced down the road, there would be a squadron or a half squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts tasked to that column. The pilot in the tank would be talking to the pilots up above, and as they move forward, they would have their own personal air support available, and the ground controller could go, "Hey Joe, we've got a roadblock up ahead. Can you go and have a look and see what you can do?" And they'd radio back and say, "Sure, just give us a minute." They'd zoom down, see what was going on. They could report back on what they saw, attack it, machine gun it, bomb it, and carry on. It was a really effective system, but it was incredibly, I'm not going to say wasteful of resources, incredibly intensive of resources. So if you've only got a certain number of squadrons, or if you're flying long distances, it becomes very difficult to provide that level of support to all your forces as they move forward. The British had a system of visual control posts and forward control posts, but for the most part, and they would have controllers that could talk to planes, but really didn't for especially the period we're talking about. So any Air Force eyes at the front would have to radio back to the lines, and there was no way to communicate with the aircraft that are right above. They did come up with Rover David or what's the other word? It's not coming to me right now. Where they did have RAF controllers that could talk to the aircraft above, but those were in the minority. That wasn't the normal way of doing it. The vast majority of sorties the Air Force were flying were prearranged, that there would be a meeting between the Army and the Air Force the previous evening. They would agree on what resources were available, what targets needed to be attacked. They'd decide how to allocate those resources. And then the squadrons would be briefed. They'd take off the next morning, next afternoon, attack those targets. But there was no way for the Army and the Air Force to deal with any changes in the interim. Had the German targets moved, had they changed, had the area been captured, they just had to assume that for the next 12 or 15 hours, there would be a stasis and it would work. And usually it did. Sometimes it didn't, but it didn't have that sort of fine-tuned control that they could make use of.
Yeah. Is this the other name that you were trying to remember?
VCP is not the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
What's the why can't I remember the term for? Come on, Alex, give me the term.
I can't think of it myself. Anyway, we can come to it later if it comes back.
Yeah. So Rover David is one of them, but there's another term that just isn't coming in. I think it was used in Italy first. But anyway, we can move on and come back to that.
Yeah.
So I think the last thing I want to talk about is Operation Infatuate. Rover Patty, that's another term for it, but it's not the one I'm thinking about yet.
Okay, we'll keep thinking. I can't think of it either. Yeah,
Cab rank is what I was thinking of.
Oh, cab rank, yeah. Sorry, yeah, we had that up already. Yeah, sorry.
So, Operation Infatuate was the amphibious operation. Sorry, we've got more comments coming in. Roulement—Roulement's a different idea. Roulement is where aircraft or squadrons would take off in England, fly missions usually over Normandy, drop their bombs, come back, land at an airfield in Normandy, refuel, rearm, fly another mission, but then stage back to England overnight. So Operation Infatuate was the amphibious operation, largely a British operation, Royal Marines and others that were doing it. And again, this is attacking a defended beach that was far more heavily defended than anything that was dealt with on D-Day, in terms of the number of bunkers, the density of bunkers, the strength of the bunkers, and everything like that. And I think it shows sort of how far amphibious doctrine had come and where the Germans were in terms of what they were like in June 44 versus October, November 44, that they managed to capture it and breach it in just one day. Sorry, before I go on, each of those red X's are a heavy gun battery. So we're talking 5, 6, 7-inch guns or bigger, anti-aircraft guns, 88s, things like that. And it's very, very heavily defended. So the amphibious landings were coming in two places. This was, let me get the zoom going again. Oops. 4th Special Service Brigade was attacking at West Capelle. That was the image that I showed you before, and was supported by an RAF attack in before. And the British 155th Brigade was crossing the Scheldt estuary, following in the path of German 15th Army from Breskins to Flushing, and attacking right in the middle of the defended city. And then timed as well was an attack along the causeway. Canadian 5th Brigade had been attacking along the causeway, trying to get over it in the sort of the second half of October. They were getting there, but they never managed to sort of get past the end of the causeway and onto Walcheren Island. So teed up just after the main amphibious landings were British attacks. It was the Scottish Highland Division, I believe. That was
51st, yeah,
kind of thing. So
no, 51st is down. Sorry, Flushing. Sorry, you're right.
Yeah.
52nd.
52nd. It's who's the chap on Twitter that's talking about them all the time? Jeffries, maybe? Can't remember.
Yeah.
Anyway. So the 1st Canadian Army, Air Marshal Harris thought that they were bomb crazy, that they didn't want to do any major attack without having, thanks Dudley, 52nd Division.
52nd, yeah.
They didn't want to do any major attack without heavy bombers. And again, they asked for it for this and were denied, but they did get a few limited attacks. You can see them there. And again, this is just a small percentage of the total number of sorties that Bomber Command is flying during this. There was a plan to have more attacks right before the amphibious landings, but the bad weather scrubbed any possibility of those. So here you can see that from the 17th of September to the 30th of October, they dropped 2,200 sorties and 10,000 tons of bombs, but less than half of those were in support of the army. So again, they're helping, but they're not helping as much as they maybe could have. And again, that's a discussion that is worth having for another day. Did Bomber Command have the right mix of missions? Were they on the right missions? But again, that goes way beyond anything that we need to talk about today. And you can see that the Canadians actually received heavier support in Boulogne and Calais, even though it wasn't as much as they would have liked or could have had. So just a quick overview of the air program on what they were supposed to be doing. The heavy bombers were supposed to come in. They didn't. The fighter bombers came in 40 to 20 minutes before the troops landed. These attacks were actually very successful. There's one occasion where a landing craft was coming in. It was receiving very heavy fire from a bunker. The Typhoons came in and launched their rockets at it at just the right amount at the right time, suppressed the enemy. The troops landed, the tanks dropped off, went in and captured the bunker. So that kind of that's almost getting to the Hollywood view of close air support. But it was the exception.
I'm just going to jump in there real quick, Mike, because it's funny because I used to have a video, I had to take it down, and haven't been able to put it back up in a new form. But there's footage from the landings of part of Infatuate, and it's pretty close to as close as I've seen in that sort of amphibious type landing of where you're seeing the fighting actually happen, and it seems fake for that reason. It seems almost fake because they're literally lining up POWs as there's fighting going on. You can just tell on the other side of a house. Like it's such striking stuff, and we just don't really talk about it too much. But again, one of the themes of the week is we don't talk about Scheldt enough. But
and it's a good example of what can be done. But you've in the absence of having a forward air controller who's talking to those planes about the closest you can have to confirmation that you're not going to strike friendly troops are those landing craft coming ashore, and you can see them approaching the beach. When you can attack, when you've got a weapons-free area, and then when they've landed and when it's time to lift your fire and go somewhere else. So it's the perfect situation for immediate and effective close air support to take place, but it really is the exception on the way the Army fights. So just like Dave is saying there, it's easier to have it when all the good guys are at sea and the bad guys are at land.
It's like you said, it's not the norm for what's happening here.
So again, some quotes from the 21st Army Group report, and this is one you can find online pretty easily. But I've highlighted. There's no doubt that the determined attack of the Typhoons had a profound effect on the operation. And it's one of the few cases I can point to where close air support had that kind of impact on an attack. I say it's the exception, not the norm. So, and then I guess I've got these numbers up here just because this number here is so small, 343 sorties on D-Day. And the majority of those took place in bad weather. They had a very difficult time. Sorry, my son is just popping in. He got an Amazon order arrived today, and he's like, "Can I open this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, go ahead." So, anyway, the domestic side of things we don't see usually. The weather was not great that day, and I think the fact that they flew 343 sorties is impressive in terms of what was accomplished, and wasn't a situation of what they had intended to do. Dave's asking about the TAC Air Force and where they're based. Yeah, they're all on the continent. Well, no, actually, I can't say they're all on the continent. Majority of them are on the continent now. Some of them are still flying out of Normandy, but they're starting to move bases farther north. Market Garden was a really difficult problem for the Tactical Air Forces because it was at the extreme limit of their ranges based on where their airfields were on the 17th of September. For them to come in and operate over the Market Garden Bridgehead, and especially to get it as far north as Arnhem, it was really stretching their distance. By this point in October, there's a lot more bases that have been moved farther north, even into the suburbs of Antwerp and things
Right.
like that. So they're much closer, but there are still a lot of aircraft that are on the in the UK, not the tactical air forces, not 83 and 84 group, but probably 2 group, the medium bombers, and certainly Bomber Command never deployed to the continent.
In that same thing, we have an earlier question. I just was waiting for a good spot to do it. I think this is it. Is the tactical sorties, is it Typhoons or dive bombing Spitfires, a mix? What kind of?
It's a mix of all of the above.
Yeah.
There are a number of dedicated Typhoon wings, some of them with bombs. The 3 Canadian Typhoon squadrons are a good example of that, bomb foons rather than rocket firing Typhoons. Yeah. But there's also a lot of squadrons of Spitfires that are being used in close air support, and the Spitfire, for all of its assets, all of its impressive attributes, is not a great down in the weeds kind of aircraft. It could carry I think it could carry as much as a 1,000-pound bomb, but it didn't like to fly low. It didn't fly well with the bomb. It was much more effective in an armed reconnaissance role, coming in using its machine guns or cannons, depending on the mark of the Spitfire. And they were used extensively in ground support more as the campaign went on, and there were fewer Luftwaffe aircraft to deal with. But it was a mix. And medium bombers are used as well, but they are not used in close support. They're on the prearranged targets. They're hitting fixed defenses, ports, rail lines, those kind of things.
Yeah. Cool. And Steven's telling you to check your email. Passing along messages.
All right.
Yeah. I don't know what that record is in regards to, but you got an email waiting. Anyway, so yeah, that's perfect. That's why I figured it's a mix based on everything I've been able to look at. And again, I'm not the air power expert, but that's
well, he sent me a scan of more details from that one slide I had. So
perfect.
So let's go, Stephen.
Cool. Yep.
So that's pretty much all I have today. I was just going to wrap it up with a few slides and move on. But so what can we take from this discussion? What can we learn? As I sort of said, are we going to consider the escape of 15th Army a blessing, or is it a missed opportunity? And I'll leave it amongst you to talk and come to a decision yourself. The escape of the army meant that we could liberate Antwerp, but it also had effects on, and I don't think enough of this is talked about, it had serious impacts on the Market Garden salient, because a lot of those counterattacks being directed at the base of the salient were coming from 15th Army units that had just escaped from the Scheldt. So if they hadn't had to fight those, could they have pushed on more? And anyway, you get into again another one of those rabbit holes of what if questions. But if we'd stopped the escape, maybe we would have had a more successful Market Garden. I don't know, but then at what cost? Without being able to open up the port of Antwerp, maybe it would still be captured today. I don't know. I'm kidding, but
I mean, sorry, yeah, just not to keep to keep going over it again, but I think you're right. It's you can do that forever. You can ask these questions, and a question leads to a question, and a question leads to a question. It's just it's impossible. But I think the way you've put it here is it's not a if or and is how I see it. It's not one or the other. It's just that's what happened, and trying to understand why that develops the way it does.
Yeah, I have a big problem with what if questions in general.
Yeah.
But I think they can be really useful to better understand what did happen and why it happened.
Yeah.
As opposed to going the sort of total alt history route of, wow, wouldn't it have been great if the Germans had landed in the UK or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one because it's going to be debated till the end of time when discussing this. And Market Garden, I mean, just talking about that last night a little bit and how these things always go forever.
So, can you pop Alex's question up? I'll give that a resounding no. I think it's the most important contribution of 1st Canadian Army But I think the BCATP is maybe a bigger contribution.
Oh, I think he's asking Army, like we already did earlier.
Yeah, that the training of airmen is probably a bigger
Yeah, I agree.
strategic contribution to the Allied victory. And there's other big Canadian contributions that can't be overlooked. But in terms of 1st Canadian Army, yes, I think the Scheldt campaign is at the top.
Yeah, I got that.
And again, that's not a zero-sum game. Just
No.
because the Scheldt is the most impressive, the Rhineland is another huge contribution, and you can never not talk about Normandy.
Yeah, I mean, I got asked that last night, and it was just Army, not Canadian Army, not 1st Canadian Army, just Canadian Army. And I, as we always do, it's a bit of a kind of pause, right? But it was, and then I kept going the same with the Rhineland. I can't not put that aside. But I agree overall for Canadian contribution. I agree with you about the BCATP, which I've been doing a ton of work on for something else, but might be a little recency bias. But I still think it is the massive contribution that no one else could have done is also something to think about.
No, for sure.
But yeah, sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, no, and I think I've covered these. I mean, the impact on Market Garden. It's also worth asking the question: could the Allies have done other interdicted the escape in other ways? And I had that one slide where I showed other places, and I think they tried some of them, but I don't think they were really committed to any of them. So again, that's another sort of what if question that is interesting, but maybe is not vital. It's very clear that 1st Canadian Army didn't receive priority during this period, and we can get into the politics of it and Montgomery's ideas and his focus, almost his sort of blinders to Market Garden and not paying attention to anything else. I think he didn't really stop to think about how important Antwerp was, and I think he thought he could get what he needed done without worrying about that, and Antwerp would just look after itself. And it really wasn't until Ramsey stepped in, and Admiral Ramsey, who was the naval commander, and said, look, we need Antwerp, we need it now, and you need to facilitate. And then once that happened, all of a sudden the ammunition restrictions that 1st Canadian Army had been fighting under were removed. 1st Canadian Army was given more troops, an American division, the Poles were restored to the Canadian command, stuff like that. And all of a sudden things started happening after Ramsey stepped in. So I really think that Montgomery, I can't say that Montgomery didn't understand logistics. He just wasn't paying attention to the right thing at the right time. And the Canadians paid a bit of a price for that because they didn't have the support they needed.
Yeah.
The second point I have is something you could say about D-Day. You could say about the Pacific landings. Really, you needed infantry to go in and clean out those positions. Artillery and even air power can't destroy them. They can suppress them, and suppression is important, but it's not the same as destruction. And that was really the key.
Yeah, and you can learn that about any infantry account of landing anywhere about how it's just not up to par for that job. But then again, the Navy's not always saying it can do that. So
yeah, exactly.
Often forgotten.
Can't emphasize this slide enough. We cannot forget the civilian cost. Stephen Burke's book on the bombing of France and the impact on civilians is absolutely essential reading. Because we talk so often about the transportation plan and the bombing of marshalling yards and bridges in advance of the Normandy landings, and we don't talk enough about the impact of the French civilians that were killed, of the Dutch civilians that were killed, and we can never lose sight of that because I don't think it's too difficult to make an argument that it was a military necessity. But you have to do it with the understanding that even if it is a military necessity, it's going to cost lives. There's going to be an impact, and you are creating more casualties for those people you're trying to liberate. So, I asked the question, is it worth it? I'll say yes, but with a huge asterisk that mostly it was worth it. There were cases when it wasn't worth it and mistakes were made. but it's something that can't be overlooked. And I think the historiography has come far enough that we won't overlook it anymore. But I think it was seriously overlooked in the past.
Yeah, I agree. I think the historiography is just generally moving forward in that direction, and it's a good thing. And it's including all kinds of things, and it's something I do look for now. And
Yeah,
if
exactly.
it doesn't have it, I because again, I do reviews like you do, and I do call it out if it's not done.
Yeah, for sure. And then I just have to point out this photo. This is one of my favorite photos that I've ever taken. It's there's a tank memorial on the top of the dike, the restored dike at West Capel.
Yeah.
And I was there on a battlefield tour, probably 20 years ago, maybe a little longer. And just as we came up to the tank, all these school kids ran up and jumped on the tank and were playing. And at first I was kind of mad because I like to take pictures of things pristine with nobody around, and all these little kids were there. And I'm like, crap, I can't do this anymore. But then I looked and I kind of realized that, well, this is what it's all about. This is what the war was about. It was about liberating this area. It was about giving these people back their freedom. And it's taking this tank, one-time article of war, death-dealing machine, and all of a sudden it's a children's playground. It's somewhere that the kids can go and have fun and enjoy it. So I thought, I'll take a picture with the kids on there. And then just as I took the picture, the one kid on the straddling the gun barrel looked at me and he salutes. I'm like, wow, I couldn't have scripted this better. So anyway, I really like that picture.
That's an amazing photo. If it's all right, if you can just stick around for a few more questions.
Yeah, of course.
Got one from Kevin Lambie, real quick, about Bomber Command and Switchback. About a bomb load being jettisoned. I haven't heard of this. I've missed it. Causing casualties.
No, I don't know about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I assume it's just on a run somewhere else.
It just sounds like one of those unfortunate happenstances in war.
Yeah.
Probably the bomber was wounded, and they had to jettison their load to make it back, and it just unfortunately fell on the Canadians. I don't know about that in specific. I'd be interested in seeing that, Kevin. If you could send me the reference, I could maybe track down a little bit more about what the Lancaster was or who was involved or something.
Yeah. Sorry, did you want to finish off with these conclusions here?
Yeah, and again, I've covered most of this, but 84 Group had a material impact on supporting the Canadians in Operation Switchback, but it's also clear that they were doing it with one hand tied behind their back, that they weren't using all of their resources. They weren't fully committed to it, partly because they were interfered with by the weather, but also because they had other priorities, other missions, other jobs to do. And the Canadians, supporting the Canadians was just one of many jobs, and perhaps not even the job they considered the most important at this period. So that's important to know. And then I guess I just have one final thought. The 21st Army Group report I talked about before, and I love this, was well nigh perfect. So it's a really interesting question for me because, well, if that's what the Army considered perfect air support, what is imperfect air support?
Yeah, what's bad?
And did they not think that there was more that air power could do for them? Because I think there's more that air power could have done for them. But it's an indication of sort of how the Army and the Air Force was getting along at that point in the war, which is also really important and really quite revealing. So it's an interesting comment. It speaks well about the air support that was offered and how it was received, but I think there's more to it as well.
Yeah, it's one I think I'm going to always struggle with, to try to fully even comprehend the different moving parts, but trying to understand the different players, what you have to do when involving these specific figures. I mean, there's conversations about Ramsey and Monty. A question, which is an easy answer. Monty considered this a sideshow? Yes, even though he probably shouldn't have.
I might wordsmith that a bit. I'm not sure he considered it a sideshow, but he treated it like a sideshow.
Yeah, I guess that's probably the best way to put it.
And I see Andreas is asking about French civilians. I think there was 60,000 French civilians killed during the war.
Yeah, well, I think this is Normandy specific, but
maybe, but
I do know the estimates keep going up every time.
I think it would have been more than, or it wouldn't have been 40,000 in just Normandy, but it was 60,000
generally
overall. But you're right. I think those numbers are going up all the time.
every time I see it, the numbers go up. Even con goes up. Again, it's interesting. And this is two things. Well, one I want to get from Dudley here. It's an interesting thing to kind of think about is the channel ports, because these go hand in hand, right, with the Scheldt, about just leaving the channel ports, right, and concentrating elsewhere. That's my reaction too. It's kind of a
it's a really good question.
It is.
I don't know what the answer is. I mean, you can't leave those big German garrisons in your rear area without dealing with them.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with Dunkirk, and it was masked off until the end of the war.
Yep.
But I think there was also the thought that perhaps the garrisons would surrender and they could be captured, and you might get port facilities in operation quickly. I think the entire campaign was progressing at lightning speed at this point,
right,
and you were kind of taking it sequentially as you arrived at it, not thinking, oh, we have to go and open the Scheldt estuary or close it to 15th Army. The attack on Boulogne is one that I'm really interested in, and I think more work needs to be done in it. And I really think there needs to be a comparative study with the British attack on Le Havre.
Yes,
because Le Havre and Boulogne are similarly sized targets, similarly sized German garrisons. When the British went into Le Havre, they had 2 divisions plus 79th Armored Division in support. They had massive amounts of heavy bomber support. They had substantial Royal Navy support, absolutely massive. And they got the job done. They leveled a big portion of the city, killed a lot of French civilians in doing it, but got the job done relatively quickly and at low cost. Boulogne, similar target, Canadians doing it. They essentially have, instead of 2 full divisions to do it, they have 2 full brigades.
Yep.
They have some bomber command support. They have no Royal Navy support, yet they're still expected to get the job done quickly and efficiently. Well, obviously that's not going to happen. And as soon as they're done with Boulogne, they have to move on to Calais and then Cap Gris-Nez. And I mean, Calais is done with essentially 1 brigade, and they just keep cycling these same brigades at high operational tempo down along the line to keep getting those same jobs done. So and I don't know what it says. Is it saying that Montgomery doesn't pay attention to the Canadians? Is it saying that he respects them to be able to get the same job done that would take 2 divisions? I don't think he's saying that. I think it's just the expectation that, oh, well, they'll get the job done some way, somehow, and we're not going to worry about it too much. So, yeah, Dudley, I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it's more, and then Dudley saying again, it could be less required to mask or screen, just like Dunkirk. But again, that Dunkirk is a little different in that aspect because the other garrisons had already fallen. I don't know. I don't think you can separate that out, to be completely honest. Again, I'm doing a lot on the channel ports lately, if you couldn't tell. Thinking about these questions and everything, particularly the bombing at Boulogne, especially because there's footage of that, which is just crazy. They like set up literally a watching post for all the big wigs to watch it happen. Like
for the attack on Mont-Lambert. And I mean, Dudley, you're talking substantial numbers of fortress troops being employed. Like, isn't it a full brigade of? Is it Belgian troops or
Czechoslovakian?
Czechoslovakian, that's right.
Dunkirk.
That are brought in to mask Dunkirk. Yep. So where are you getting a brigade for Calais and a brigade for Boulogne? And you also have to remember that the gun batteries at Cap Gris-Nez are a huge threat to operations in the Channel, because you've got big bunkers with 15 or 16-inch guns that are capable of hitting targets in England, and are certainly a threat to anything in the Channel. So you can't just leave those alone. So I'm not sure the Canadians had a choice about masking those positions, because you had to take out Calais and Boulogne to get to Cap Gris-Nez. So it might have been
I mean,
in that kind of order of operations.
Yeah, and I think he kind of agrees. I think it's just it's an interesting one, because I think it's, again, you have the air aspect, which I'm going to have you on for that. And thinking about it in that sense, it's just, to me, sorry, I've been confusing this all in my head because I'm trying to connect, because Monty people are asking about Monty, right? Like, what is he thinking? It's hard, right? Because I haven't seen that study. I don't know if it exists. If I'm wrong, somebody please tell me. That is really using those primary sources of what he left and not using his later on finessing of everything you want to, whatever you want to call it, and looking at that in his attitudes about this, because leaving that, having 1st Canadian Army strung out, or at least I think Great Dominion said the same thing, along the Channel Coast, that long left flank speaks volumes, because it's, and again, the importance of the channel ports keeps changing, right? We're going to use it to bring in supplies. Oh, now we can see the port is destroyed. We can't use it. It's not usable for months. It's just, to me, it seems rather too ad hoc. I don't know if that's because of, like you said earlier, it's after the, breakout from the Seine, we're just pushing them back. We're not sure where they're going to stop. Again, it's something I'd love to do more into, but again, it's just the use of time. And so many primary documents to go through in 2 different countries would be an interesting project, but a difficult one to do. So again, I think that's what someone would need to do to kind of bring these questions kind of not to bed, because they're never going to stop, but offer a more valuable insight, I think.
Yeah, the more I read, the more I study, the more I write, the more I realize I don't know. And,
yeah, exactly.
It's problematic.
Yeah, exactly. Especially for 21st Army Group. I'm like, oh, I know this. And I go into it and I'm like, oh, I don't know anything, particularly for Monty. But yeah, I think we've got all the questions and lots of good discussions off of them, which is always awesome. Yeah, one question I did want to ask you, if that's okay, just one more for me. You mentioned it earlier about the lack of airborne. Would that have made a difference in your, I know this is a what if, I don't know. That's the thing. I just love to hear an opinion on that, because it's something I keep coming back to.
Yeah, I don't think airborne, like you're talking about paratroopers being brought in. Yeah. I don't see where they could have been used. I mean, you can go back to Dieppe, and Dieppe was originally supposed to have 2 parachute groups going to attack those gun batteries instead of the number 3 and number 4 commando. And I think they would have been an absolute, clusterfuck if that had happened, because you can't guarantee they're going to be dropped accurately enough so that they have enough combat power to take their objective. You just have to look at what happened on D-Day with 82nd, 101st, 6th Para being dropped all over Normandy, and they got their jobs done. But I think in many ways what they achieved was as much causing confusion and sowing a question of what exactly is going on in the minds of the German commanders, that they couldn't figure out where the Schwerpunkt was. And I don't think airborne troops would be useful in a discrete operation like Dieppe, like anything in the Channel ports, like Walcheren Island. I mean, what is the one objective you want to do? What are you trying to accomplish with those troops? Can you get enough down safely and have them concentrated to achieve what you want them? Yeah. How many are you going to lose by dropping them in the Channel, or dropping them in the Scheldt, or dropping them in flooded areas? I don't see any possible way to use them. And again, are you going to create a situation like Market Garden where you drop a division and aren't able to get in there to support it in time? Yeah. So yeah, it's a valid question. It's one that's worth considering, but I don't see where they get used.
Yeah, the only reason I asked that is because the airborne element from the air, using air resources, not from, say, Bomber Command or from the Tactical Air Forces. But I've seen it, just seen other people arguing this and other historians arguing this, that in a way it's part of the same attitude as the lack of support. And I think that's one where you got to kind of pull it apart a little bit and be like, okay, well, it could have been, but when you think about it, in the actuality, because I think the plan was to drop them on Middelburg, which is in the middle of Walcheren Island. There's no guarantee that's going to happen.
Yeah, but what do they do there? Like, exactly. Okay, capture Middelburg.
Yeah, and that was the
okay.
question.
So what?
Yeah, and to what
Yeah.
end, right? Was the question. It was going to be
Yeah.
some sort of link up with the commandos coming in, and they're like, well, we don't need to do that. Anyway, I just wanted to ask that because of the air resources that go into this. It's fascinating that there's questions about gliders. We know that would not have worked.
Yeah.
There's no
I
room.
mean, the
Even
thing
if it was
about
flooded, there's no room.
airborne forces is they've got 24, 48 hours on their own, and then they need to be
Mhm.
resupplied, and you got to keep resupplying them. And I mean, we talked about Walcheren especially being like, it was a bastion for air
Yeah.
defenses. It was
Yeah,
a place
exactly.
that Bomber Command had circled in red and told its planes not to go over it because there were so many 88s there. And the idea that you're going to send in C-47s and gliders to do something, oh my God, like,
Yeah, I know. It just would have not gone well. It's one of those questions why I wanted to ask that. It's one of those. I just made a video that's going to be coming out in a few days, but Canadians have a chip on our shoulder. I don't think any of us can deny that when it comes to this stuff, right? We're the Cinderella army, we're less resources. At some point, adding more resources is just going to get people killed. So it's not always just, those poor Canadians or, well, they did it to us again. Just kind of one of those ones I wanted to put to bed. But yeah, so it makes perfect sense. And Norma, who loves her Scheldt, knows this stuff and sums it up quite well. Okay, I think that's it. I don't think we're missing anything. Sorry, not enough float planes. Yeah, that would have done the trick, Pete. Well done. Anyway, so thanks, Mike. I really enjoyed you coming on again. You always on the channel, always do a great job. So thank you for coming on again.
No, my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Brad, and thanks everybody for tuning in and all your great questions.
Yeah. So again, thanks everyone for watching. So tomorrow, the next show is going to be bright and early for us of those on the east side of North America. I got it at 8 a.m. Because Robert wanted to do it for his afternoon. So 8 a.m. Eastern time. Robert Katzberg is going to be on talking about plotter fighting and an individual he got to know really, really well. And I kind of want to leave those details as unspecific as possible to get people to tune in to find out what's going on to watch it afterwards. So thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see everybody tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon, depending on where you're from. So thanks again, everyone, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Have a great rest of the day, everybody. Bye.